Hello there. Today I wanted to take a look at a rare and unusual wine grown in the Auckland area, and one that could be an amazing bargain. The wine is from a winery I didn't particularly well know, Fino Valley. They're a small winery based in the Henderson Valley. And the wine is from Opanuku Creek Vineyard, which is the vineyard they have in the Henderson Valley itself. It's a 2024 vintage, and it's made from a grape variety called White Diamond. Now, the reason this could be an amazing bargain is that there's quite a high profile White Diamond made by a winery in Monterey, about 3 hours drive to the north of us, called Longview, and they sell a wine made from the same grape variety for $1,285, whereas I paid $30 for this. So I'll be intrigued to see how this compares to the wine from Longview. Alas, I haven't done a video tasting of that wine, but I have tried it. Fino Valley Winery was established in 1966 by an immigrant family who'd come from Croatia, Ivan and Milka Tvrdeich, if I'm saying that correctly. Ivan and Milka had come to New Zealand from Croatia with their 3 sons in 1951. And these days, the family claim that their winemaking history goes back 100 years, including a period when the family was making wines in Croatia. Having purchased their 4-hectare parcel of land in the Henderson Valley, they relocated an old house onto the site, which is today is still their family homestead. While the winery was developed, initially they were grazing dairy cattle. They then went on to have strawberry fields and then apricot orchards. But eventually Ivan planted grapes, something he was familiar with from having grown them in his native Croatia. And I don't think they had a lot of money. The original vines were planted by their 3 sons. They ended up constructing trellising using homemade concrete posts, which evidently was very normal in those days, even cutting branches from trees in the nearby forest to create stakes to support the trellising. Grape varieties planted in the 1960s and 70s originally were predominantly hybrids and muscat varieties, and at first they were making largely fortified wines labelled mostly as ports and sherries. But the 1970s saw a massive expansion in table wine in New Zealand. They were very successful when they planted Riesling, Chenin Blanc and Chardonnay to make light aromatic table wines. Now today the winery is surrounded by suburbia, particularly towards the bottom end of the Henderson Valley where they are. Now the winery has the capacity to produce 250,000 litres of wine a year, and they've kept their 4-acre home block, and unlike many other producers in the area, have continued to grow vines there. In fact, they suggest that the location, just 20 minutes drive from the centre of Auckland, probably makes these some of the most valuable bits of vineyard land anywhere in New Zealand and possibly in the world. Now today the company sells mostly Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir from their vineyards in Marlborough. Also, there's increasing interest in complex structured reds they produce from their vineyards in Hawke's Bay, including plantings on the Bridge Park Triangle. However, from both these regions the fruit is actually transported up to the winery in Auckland for processing. Now, the White Diamond grape variety was produced in 1855. It was a successful crossing of Concord and Iona, both of them hybrids of Vitis vinifera and Vitis labrusca varieties, and thus it itself is a hybrid. It was developed in New York State, and as is typical for hybrid varieties, it has a thick skin, small berries, high sugar levels and some pungent aromas. Now in the Auckland region it's sometimes confused with a similar grape variety called Niagara, which is another crossing with Concord as one of its parents, so I guess that's not surprising. Unfortunately, the variety didn't inherit its parents' ability to thrive in cold climates, and so it never really spread very far from upstate New York. The Finger Lakes American Viticultural Area, AVA, is probably where you'll find the best wines that are produced from the White Diamond grape variety. They tend to refer to it there simply as Diamond. There are also, I'm told, some quite good examples from the Lake Erie area as well. Now, White Diamond came to New Zealand as part of the New Zealand government trying to encourage growers to cultivate hybrids. This started in 1927 and was an idea that lasted through until the early 1960s. The most prominent varieties were probably Sable and Bacco. These were grape varieties being used for the production of fortified wines. so their varietal character wasn't particularly important. Other notable varieties at the time included Isabella, which in New Zealand goes under the name of Albany Surprise, and then also a red variety, Chambourcin. And the idea of focusing on hybrid varieties is that because New Zealand's wine production was largely concentrated around Auckland and in Northland, this was an area with quite high rainfall, about 1.5 metres a year, and that the thick-skinned hybrid varieties would deal much better with the region's humidity. Fino Valley's Auckland vineyards are divided into 3 plots, and these are simply labelled the bottom, middle and top block. It was the bottom block that was planted first. Today that's planted mostly to red grape varieties, with Malbec growing there alongside Chambourcin, Cabernet Franc and several varieties of Muscat. And the Muscat particularly, rather than being trained in straight vertical hedges, is actually trained at a high overhead level. The soil type here is alluvial, and the vines, certainly in the bottom and middle sections of the vineyard, are planted alongside the Opanuku Creek, which flows from the Waitakere range of hills in the west down to the Waitemata harbour in the east. The top block, which was planted more recently in the 1980s, I believe, is slightly more elevated, sloping land, quite heavy clay soils. My understanding is that the white diamond comes from the middle block. Now the fruit here is all hand-picked, it's 100% distemmed, it's crushed and it's pressed, and it undergoes both fermentation and maturation in stainless steel tanks. So fermentation is temperature controlled to try and make sure the wine retains the light, fresh, crisp, aromatic nature of the fruit. Wine is bottled young to retain its freshness and is lightly fined and filtered into bottle. The one thing I've not been able to ascertain is quite how the sweetness is arrived at in the wine. I'm not aware of any efforts to concentrate the fruit. Certainly given the fact it's thick-skinned, it's unlikely to shrivel or botrytise in any way. Whether it's late harvested to increase sugar levels to ensure there's sugar remaining after fermentation, I don't know. I think it's more likely that there's going to be a back blending of concentrated grape juice once the wine has finished its fermentation. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? I've got it here in my glasses, beautiful clear, medium to pale, greenish yellow there. Swirling it, the wine is labelled as having 13% alcohol, and it's clinging quite readily to the glass. Quite reluctantly, yes, just starting to form some tears there. The wine is labelled as sweet. Now I'm expecting that's going to be more sort of medium sweetness than a full dessert sweetness. It certainly doesn't have a depth of colour or a syrupy viscosity that suggests to me it's going to be a fully sweet wine. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Gosh. Okay. That is very clearly the aroma you get from a hybrid grape variety. Although I should say, frequently the aromas of hybrids are unpleasant. And other than the fact that I recognise this as the musky sort of note that you get from a hybrid grape variety, I wouldn't actually say it was completely unpleasant. So there is this muskiness, and then behind it there's a lovely richness and a ripeness. And there are notes of pear and peach, rich stone fruit, almost approaching sort of an apricot-y richness. I'd even suggest there's a little bit of honeyed sweetness there as well. Certainly there's a rich, confected, sort of candied note to the aromas. Just to come back to that muskiness, sometimes on a red wine, muskiness can seem sort of animalistic and it can be quite objectionable. Here it's almost like the sort of the sickly sweet perfume of lilies of the valley or something like that. And while there are dusty notes, there's almost a note of mandarin orange in there. I've been conditioned to dislike that muskiness, but actually here it's not really objectionable. So let's taste and see what we make of that. Gosh, the sweetness is quite obvious. It's not a luscious honeyed sweetness in terms of its texture. Now, I've not seen a technical sheet for this wine, but I'd suggest that this is probably somewhere in the region of 25, maybe up to 35 grams per litre sugar. It's a wine that is medium, perhaps to medium sweet. The sugar is not particularly clean here, so that does make me think it's probably a back blended sweetness. And what I mean by that is that if you stop a wine's fermentation to leave sweetness in it, what happens is that of the two sugars that you get in grape juice, glucose and fructose, yeasts will preferentially consume glucose, leaving fructose, which is a cleaner sweetness, in the wine. So if you stop the fermentation at that point, you get a lovely, clean, fresh sweetness. And that was what I found in a tasting I did recently of a Riesling Spätlese from Villeneuve. And you get a much cleaner, more focused, less syrupy sugar. I'm afraid that's not the case here, and it makes the sweetness a little clumsy. Having said that, that sweetness is supported by some quite intense fruit. So all the notes of pear, peach, apricot and mandarin slowly build through the palate and support the sweetness reasonably well. Now, I haven't mentioned the wine's acidity at all. It doesn't stand out as being particularly sharp or harsh, but actually the finish of the wine I have in my mouth doesn't feel particularly sweet. Thus my presumption is that there is reasonably good acidity there, and that's just helping to clean the palate up a little, although it does finish with those quite musky notes, as I say, almost that sort of quite sickly lily of the valley sort of overpowering perfume at the end there. The flavours are lasting reasonably well, the alcohol is in balance, not intruding in any way to mask the fruit, and the flavours are lasting quite well. This is certainly not a wine I'd be laying down in the cellar. I think this is a speciality wine, perhaps an unusual novelty. It has a level of sweetness between a sort of an off-dry wine and a fully sweet wine that I think some drinkers do find appealing, and the fruit intensity is quite impressive. Now, I mentioned earlier a wine from another estate, Longview, which is selling, I suspect, aimed largely at the Chinese market, where this style of sort of quite exotic sweet wine is quite popular, and that they were selling that for 1,285 New Zealand dollars. Now, I paid $30 for this, and from my experience of having tasted the Longview wine, I would say this wine is every bit as good. In fact, one point I would make is that the notes say that this is made from vines that are 50 years old, which would explain some of the concentration I'm seeing in the fruit. Whereas Longview, for their very expensive wine, are making that from vines that are only 30 years old. There's no great complexity in the wine. I'm not talking about the oak influence at all. This is quite straightforward fruit whose concentration and purity comes from the vineyard. It's not been modified by a long aging process, and it's not particularly a wine to stay in the cellar. It's a very particular style of wine with quite a small audience, so I guess I'm saying I don't really think I'm getting an enormous bargain, but I have saved myself the annoyance of paying a very large amount of money for a fairly well-made, simple wine from a rarely seen grape variety. There isn't a Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this vintage, or in fact for any vintage of this wine, I'm afraid. And in some ways I'm somewhat conflicted, because there's a side of me that says I just don't like this musky aroma and flavour I'm getting. The flavours here are clean, they're perfumed, they're exotic, they're expressed well, and they're opening up quite nicely. So as far as scoring the wine's concerned, I would certainly be scoring this 87 out of 100, possibly 88. While it's not a fine wine that collectors are going to seek out to put in their cellar, I think this is a pretty well-made wine, displaying some actually quite concentrated and interesting fruit, and I love the fact it's challenging me. So thank you for watching the tasting. I hope you found this of interest. The only trouble being that if you're interested in trying this wine, I'm not sure how extensive their exports are. I certainly can't see anything on the Wine Searcher website. I will leave a link that'll take you to the winery's webpage on Wine Searcher, and that will give you contact details if you wanted to follow that up. So again, thank you for joining me. If you've enjoyed the tasting, it would be fabulous if you'd press the like button. If you're watching these tastings and enjoying them, do please consider signing up. That would really help me to develop the channel further. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please pass it on to them. That would be a fabulous endorsement coming from you. And if you have any comments or questions, anything you want to say about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else related to that, do please pop your comments and questions in the comments box below. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the very near future and come and join me for another tasting. But until then, bye for now.